Right now, across two very different parts of the country, the atmosphere is loading up with exactly the kind of energy that produces dangerous weather. And the people who track this for a living will tell you that today is not the main event. It is the warm-up. 2026 has already become one of the most violent, severe weather years in modern American memory. And the newest numbers show it is not slowing down. Today, a fresh round of storms is firing from the mid-Atlantic coastline all the way out to the high plains. But here's the part that should really get your attention. Forecasters are now watching signs of a much larger, multi-day severe weather setup building over the northern plains and the upper Midwest by the time next weekend arrives. If that signal holds the way it is currently trending, it could turn into the most significant tornado threat of the back half of this month. So let's break down exactly what is happening today, what is coming later this week, and why some meteorologists are already bracing for something much bigger. Before we get into today's forecast, you need to understand the year this storm season has already been, because none of what's happening right now is happening in a vacuum. This is a season that started early, hit hard, and has barely let up since. Back in March, an EF2 tornado tore across Highway 60 near Fairview, Oklahoma, and it killed a mother and her daughter who were caught on the road when the storm crossed their path. In the days that followed, more tornadoes touched down near Beggs and on the north side of Tulsa, tearing through homes and damaging a middle school. That same month, a separate outbreak hit southern Michigan, where tornadoes near Union Lake and Edwardsburg flattened entire neighborhoods. At least 4 people died there, including a 12-year-old boy, and more than a dozen others were hurt. Central Illinois got hit too, with 6 separate tornadoes confirmed from a single Sunday storm system. And all of that happened before spring even had a real chance to settle in. April did not slow down. A major outbreak on the 17th and 18th brought a moderate risk of severe weather stretching from northern Oklahoma into southeastern Kansas and western Missouri, with winds forecast up to 90 miles an hour and hail the size of softballs. Strong tornadoes touched down across a corridor running from northeast Iowa into northwest Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and the far southeastern corner of Minnesota. A high-end EF2 tornado tracked through southern Rochester, Minnesota, injuring 2 people and damaging homes. Another high-end EF2 tore through Lena, Illinois, and local officials had to ask people to stay out of town while crews worked through the wreckage. Then, less than a week later, an EF4 tornado struck near Enid, Oklahoma. By the time April was finished, the month had produced roughly 80 confirmed tornadoes, an extremely active total for that time of year. And then, strangely, everything went quiet. May, which is usually one of the most dangerous months of the entire year for tornadoes, turned out to be one of the calmest Mays in recent memory. Only about 119 tornadoes were confirmed across the entire month, and just a handful of those were even rated as strong. Forecasters pointed to a shift happening far out in the Pacific Ocean, where a fading La Niña pattern was weakening the upper-level winds that storms need to start rotating. For a few weeks, it looked like maybe, just maybe, 2026 was going to calm down. That did not last. On May 18th, a moderate risk of severe weather was issued for parts of Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas, with forecasters specifically warning about the potential for EF3 or stronger tornadoes. A high-end EF3 tornado touched down in Howard County, Nebraska, and it happened to be observed directly by scientists working a federal tornado research project, giving meteorologists an unusually detailed look at exactly how it formed. A tornado emergency, the most urgent warning the National Weather Service issues, was declared for the small town of Pawnee City. By the end of that outbreak, 58 tornadoes had touched down. It was an early warning sign of what June was about to bring. On June 10th and 11th, a violent outbreak tore through the Kankakee River Valley in northern Illinois and northwest Indiana. A tornado emergency was issued for the town of Washburn, Illinois, after a large EF3 tornado formed and bore down on the community. That same supercell went on to produce a second EF3 that struck the southeastern part of Streator, Illinois. Just up the road, an EF1 tornado tracked through Dwight, and 2 more damaging tornadoes touched down in Ross and Hebron, Indiana, before a high-end EF3 struck near Coots. In total, 68 tornadoes were confirmed from that single outbreak. The storms were so powerful that long-distance Amtrak trains running through the region were delayed by as much as 20 hours. And in Des Moines, a man at a homeless encampment was killed when straight-line winds, not even a tornado, knocked a tree down on top of him. That detail matters, because it is a reminder that you do not need a tornado on the ground for this kind of weather to take a life. And then came the outbreak that really put an exclamation point on the month. In the middle of June, the Storm Prediction Center placed a moderate risk, one of the highest levels they issue, directly over central Illinois and stretching into northwest Indiana. An unusually deep area of low pressure for the time of year helped twist the atmosphere into a shape that almost never shows up in mid-June, and forecasters specifically flagged the potential for intense, long-track, and potentially violent tornadoes. The forecast verified. A broken line of supercells developed and tracked across the region, producing long-lived tornadoes and large hail as it crossed from Missouri into Illinois and Indiana. Tornado watches went up for millions of people, wind gusts reached 75 miles an hour, and hail up to 3 inches in diameter fell across parts of the corridor. At the very same time, a tropical system was taking shape in the Gulf of Mexico. It would go on to become Tropical Storm Arthur, the first named storm of the Atlantic season, and it made landfall along the upper Texas coast almost at the exact moment the Midwest outbreak was unfolding. The story did not end when the Illinois and Indiana storms moved east. The next day, the same energy that had fueled that outbreak kept firing tornadic supercells across a wide stretch of the Northeast, the Mississippi Valley, and the Gulf Coast. At least 31 tornadoes touched down, including an EF2 that straddled the Indiana-Kentucky border. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Arthur was doing damage of its own, spinning up 9 separate tornadoes across Louisiana and Mississippi as it crept slowly to the northeast. One of those tornadoes tore through a mobile home park in Avondale, Louisiana, injuring 2 people. Another, an EF1, knocked down trees that had stood for more than a century near City Park in New Orleans. A third moved through Pearlington, Mississippi. It was strong enough to trigger one of the most serious tornado warnings the National Weather Service issues, the kind reserved only for situations where a confirmed dangerous tornado is already on the ground and bearing down on people. By the time the calendar reached the 16-day mark in June, the country had logged roughly 2,700 damaging wind reports. That is the second highest total for that stretch of the month since record-keeping began, behind only the legendary hyperactive June of 2008, which produced over 3,600 wind reports in the same span. If the pattern we have seen for the rest of June holds up, this month has a real shot at challenging the all-time record for wind reports in a single June, a number that sits at 5,554. That is the kind of year we are living through right now. So when meteorologists tell you to pay attention to what is coming next, they are not exaggerating for effect. They have the receipts to back it up. Which brings us to today. As of this Monday, the Storm Prediction Center has placed a slight risk of severe weather over 2 very different stretches of the country, plus a second, more isolated threat running through the middle of the nation. None of today's numbers come close to the violent setup from the middle of the month, and that is worth saying clearly so nobody panics over the wrong thing. But what is happening today still matters, both because real damage is possible in the places it hits, and because of what it is helping set up for later this week. Start on the East Coast. Forecasters are watching a weak area of low-pressure track from the Appalachians into the mid-Atlantic today, riding underneath a fast river of wind several thousand feet up. East of the mountains, from the Carolinas up through Virginia and into the Delmarva Peninsula, temperatures are forecast to climb into the mid-90s. And that kind of heat, sitting underneath strong upper-level winds, is a recipe for organized, dangerous thunderstorms. Some of those storms are expected to become supercells, the most dangerous and longest-lived storm type there is. The biggest concern across most of this zone is damaging, straight-line wind, the kind that can snap power poles and bring down century-old trees just as easily as a weak tornado can. But there is a narrow corridor running from northern Virginia into the Delmarva Peninsula right along a warm front, where the wind is turning and twisting with height in a way that raises the tornado risk specifically. Forecasters were debating whether to add a formal tornado probability to that zone, which tells you they are taking it seriously, even though the official numbers stayed conservative. Now slide all the way across the country to the high plains. A weak area of low pressure is forming over eastern Wyoming today, and it is dragging air up and over the higher terrain of eastern Colorado and Wyoming in what meteorologists call upslope flow. When air gets forced to rise just by running into higher ground, it cools quickly and can turn into thunderstorms in a hurry, especially when there is plenty of instability waiting in the atmosphere above it. Strong west to northwest winds aloft are expected to organize those storms into supercells, and the biggest threat from them is large to very large hail, the kind that can total a car's exterior and shred a season's worth of crops in a matter of minutes. A few isolated strong wind gusts are possible too. This corridor is more rural than the mid-Atlantic threat, but anyone living, working, or driving through the high plains of Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, or Kansas today should expect the sky to turn ugly by mid to late afternoon. There are 2 more zones worth knowing about today. Across northwest Texas, an outflow boundary left behind by an earlier round of storms in Oklahoma is expected to bump into a dry line, the boundary that separates moist air moving in from the east and dry desert air pushing in from the west. Most of the atmosphere there is actually fighting against storms forming at all, but if even 1 or 2 manage to break through right where those 2 boundaries cross, they could become capable of producing every type of severe weather at once. And running from the southern Appalachians down into the mid-south and the southern plains, leftover moisture and instability from an overnight cluster of storms over Oklahoma and Arkansas could spark a few more rounds of damaging wind through the afternoon, though forecasters expect that threat to stay fairly limited and scattered. It helps to understand why wind shear matters so much in all of this, because it is the difference between a storm that just rains hard and a storm that starts rotating. Picture the wind blowing one direction near the ground and a completely different direction, and a much faster speed, a few thousand feet up. That difference is what forces a thunderstorm's updraft to tilt and spin instead of just rising straight up and collapsing on itself. Add enough heat and moisture at the surface, and you get an engine that can run for hours, tracking across the landscape rather than firing and dying in 20 minutes. That is the basic recipe behind every supercell we have talked about today, and it is the same recipe forecasters are watching build over the northern plains for later this week. So that is today's forecast in plain terms, real but not historic. The real story is what comes next, because as this week goes on, the pattern is going to shift, and it is going to shift in a direction that should have your attention if you live anywhere near the nation's midsection. By Wednesday and Thursday, a dome of high pressure is forecast to build into the central and northern plains, and that is going to lock in another round of upslope flow across eastern Colorado and Wyoming. The same mechanism we just talked about for today, except stronger. Moderate to strong instability is expected to build in that corridor on both days, supported by 40 to 50 knots of west-northwesterly wind several thousand feet up, more than enough to organize rotating storms. This is shaping up to be a fairly narrow threat, mostly confined to the higher elevation prairies where the rising terrain and the available energy line up best. But where it does line up, supercells capable of producing large hail will be a near-daily occurrence through the middle of the week. Then for a couple of days, the atmosphere is expected to take a breath. High pressure is forecast to slide east across the plains on Friday and Saturday, and that should bring a genuine lull in severe weather, the first real quiet stretch this region has seen in weeks. If you have outdoor plans for that Friday or Saturday anywhere in the Central Plains, this is probably your window. But do not get too comfortable, because that lull is not the end of the story. It is the calm before the next system, and this next one is the part forecasters are watching most closely of all. Starting Sunday and continuing into the early part of the following week, models are showing a strong signal for a deep trough digging into the northern plains and the upper Midwest, paired with a much stronger jet stream pushing south out of Canada. When forecasters talk about troughing like this, they mean a dip in the upper-level wind pattern that drags cooler, faster-moving air down into a region that has been baking under early summer heat for days. That collision between cool air aloft and warm, moist air at the surface is exactly the kind of setup that has produced some of the most dangerous tornado outbreaks in American history. The Storm Prediction Center's own long-range forecasters are already saying that several days of substantial severe weather are possible during that stretch. They have not pinned down exact days or exact locations yet, and they are being upfront that the timing and strength of that pattern could still shift one way or the other. But the fact that the signal is showing up this consistently, this far in advance, over a region stretching from the Dakotas into Minnesota, Iowa, and the wider upper Midwest, is exactly the kind of early warning meteorologists pay closest attention to. There is a reason this next threat is aiming farther north than the outbreaks we just walked through. Tornado season in the United States does not stay in one place all year. It starts in the Gulf Coast in the southeast in late winter, climbs into the southern plains by spring, and then marches steadily northward as the calendar moves toward summer, eventually settling over the northern plains, the upper Midwest, and the Dakotas by the time July arrives. We are right at that handoff point on the calendar, the stretch of late June when the most dangerous storm track shifts away from places like Illinois, Missouri, and Oklahoma, and toward Minnesota, the Dakotas, and the high plains of Montana and Wyoming. If the long-range signal for next weekend holds, it would be arriving almost exactly on schedule for where this kind of severe weather typically goes in late June, just amplified by how unusually active this year already is. So why has this year behaved this way in the first place? Part of the answer goes back to a pattern that was sitting out in the Pacific Ocean as the year began. A weakening La Nina pattern through the winter and early spring helped keep the jet stream locked into a configuration that repeatedly sent waves of energy straight across the country's midsection, which is part of why March and April turned violent so quickly. The Great Lakes were also unusually icy heading into spring, with more than half of the lake surface still frozen in early February, the most ice cover seen since 2019. That cold pool of air sitting over the Great Lakes acted almost like a brake pedal, holding back severe weather across the northern Midwest deep into April while the action stayed bottled up farther south. As that cold air pool finally broke down and La Nina faded out completely heading into summer, the brakes came off, and the storm track that had been stuck over the southern half of the country was free to expand and shift north, which is exactly the transition we are watching unfold right now in real time. Here is something else worth knowing, because it cuts against the assumption a lot of people make. Even with everything we have just walked through, long-range forecasters actually expect the final tornado count for all of 2026 to come in lower than last year. The projection sits somewhere between 1,050 and 1,250 tornadoes nationwide, compared to over 1,500 confirmed last year, and close to the long-term historical average of around 1,225. That might sound like good news, and in terms of raw numbers, it is. But forecasters have been careful to point out that a quieter season on paper does not mean a safer season in practice. The flip side of fewer tornadoes this year has been a sharp increase in damaging straight-line wind events and flash flooding. And both of those hazards can affect a far larger area at once than a single tornado track ever could. A quiet number on a chart does not protect a single house if that house happens to be the one a storm hits. The flash flooding risk deserves its own mention because it has quietly become one of the defining hazards of this entire year. Several of the outbreaks we have already discussed dropped staggering amounts of rain on top of their wind and tornado damage, and soil across large stretches of the Midwest and South has stayed saturated for weeks at a time, because storm after storm keeps rolling over the same ground before it has a chance to dry out. When the ground cannot absorb any more water, even a normal, unremarkable thunderstorm can produce flash flooding within minutes, turning a quiet creek into a wall of water. That risk does not go away during the quiet stretch later this week. If anything, it builds in the background, waiting for the next heavy rain producer to come along and push already saturated ground past its limit. There's also a darker pattern worth naming directly, because it has shown up again and again this year. Several of the most dangerous tornadoes of 2026 have struck overnight, or in the hours just before dawn, when most people are either asleep or not actively watching the sky. A tornado that forms at 2 in the morning is statistically far more likely to kill someone than the exact same tornado forming at 2 in the afternoon, simply because warnings cannot wake up a phone that has been silenced for the night, and because darkness erases the visual cues that would normally make someone run for shelter on instinct. As the severe weather threat shifts north over the coming days, daylight is actually working slightly in people's favor, since late June carries some of the longest daylight hours of the entire year across the northern half of the country. But that advantage disappears completely the moment storms reorganize into an overnight squall line, which is exactly the kind of setup we have already seen multiple times this season turn deadly with almost no warning. If you live anywhere in the path of what we have talked about today, from the Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas, across the High Plains, and especially anywhere from the Dakotas down through Minnesota and Iowa heading into next weekend, this is the moment to get your plan in order, not the moment you hear a warning siren for the first time. Know the difference between a watch and a warning. A watch means the ingredients are in place and you need to be ready to act on short notice. A warning means a storm has already been spotted or detected on radar, and you need to take shelter immediately. No waiting and no double checking. Make sure you have a way to receive warnings overnight that does not rely on you being awake and staring at your phone, because some of the deadliest tornadoes in American history have struck while entire towns were asleep. Know exactly where you would go inside your home, away from windows, on the lowest level, in the most interior room available. If you live in a mobile home, know in advance where the nearest sturdy shelter is, because a mobile home offers almost no real protection against either a tornado or a severe straight-line wind event. And if hail the size of golf balls or larger is in the forecast for your area, get vehicles into a garage or under solid cover before the storms arrive, because hail at that size can shatter windshields and cause real structural damage to a roof in a matter of minutes. Here is the bigger picture worth sitting with. 2026 was already on pace to be remembered as one of the most relentless, severe weather years in recent American history before today's storms ever fired a single bolt of lightning. What is happening right now, the storms over the Mid-Atlantic, the hailmakers rolling off the High Plains, the quiet pause expected this weekend, none of it is the headline. The headline is what comes after that pause. Forecasters are watching a pattern build that has all the ingredients of a major, multi-day tornado threat aimed at the northern plains and the upper Midwest, arriving right on the calendar's natural schedule for that part of the country, but loaded with more energy than that schedule usually carries this time of year. Nobody can tell you yet exactly which towns will end up in the crosshairs, and anyone who claims they can this far out is getting ahead of the science. But the signal is there. It has shown up consistently across multiple forecast cycles, and in a year that has already proven, again and again, that it does not take much for a setup like this to turn violent, that signal alone is reason enough to start paying attention now, while there is still time to prepare, instead of waiting until the warning sirens are the ones doing the talking.